Well, thank you very much, and it's so wonderful to see you all here, I must say. Now, we always do get good representation from government, but this is really the first time that we've seen substantial representation from the private sector. And I'm sure it's a direct result of our Tansley lecturer this year, John Manley. And while it's my great pleasure and honor to be able to introduce John Manley, allow me just to say a few words about this lecture and about the individual it is named after. So, who was Don Tansley? First and foremost, he was a person who made things work, whatever the circumstances. He tackled some of the most difficult and often thankless jobs in the public sector. He spent over a decade working in Saskatchewan's famed Budget Bureau, really an organization that trained some of Canada's finest public servants. He eventually rose to Deputy Provincial Treasurer within the Department of Provincial Treasury, but his rise was interrupted when he was made chair of the board whose task it was to rescue the Interprovincial Steel Corporation. At that point, it was facing imminent bankruptcy. The provincial government had actually become a minority shareholder to prop up the company, and Tansley's job was to help the private sector owners and managers figure out a way to get the company back on its feet. While IPSCO would not only survive, but it would become Western Canada's largest producer of steel. So how's that for a public-private partnership? As his reward, Don Tansley was appointed chair of the Medical Care Insurance Commission, just as the doctors were preparing for a 23-day strike and protest over the introduction of Medicare. He had the temerity to ask the Premier if danger pay came with the assignment. Of course, it didn't. Now, in 1964, Tansley moved on to a much more pleasant job. He went to New Brunswick, where he became the Deputy Minister of Finance and Industry and the head of the Public Service. It was up to him to lead the modernization of the provincial government in New Brunswick, as well as figure out a way to actually implement equal opportunity, which had been talked about for years, but the Robichaud government was stymied as to how it should actually be implemented. And Don Tansley was the guy that figured out how to actually implement it. In 1968, when he realized that the Robichaud government and cabinet was beginning to lose its political will, and equal opportunity was very difficult, he moved to the Federal Public Service. While he was at the Canadian International Development Agency, he took a 2-year leave of absence to work with the International Red Cross on a special assignment. His job was to basically figure out the International Red Cross, figure out what was wrong with it, and provide a report that would fix the International Red Cross. The report was blunt and clear as to what the problems were, but very constructive in setting out how these problems could be fixed through a new organization. Quite naturally, many responded to the report very negatively. And in fact, it took another 15 years for that report to be implemented. Years later, he was recognized for his work when the president of the International Red Cross got up and said, if we had only implemented Don Tansley's report, then we would have saved ourselves a huge number of problems. And as reward for this job well done on the international scene when he came back to Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau made Tansley the CEO of the highly unpopular Anti-Inflation Act. It was his job to make that work. And he did, a job that probably nobody else in the Federal Public Service wanted. He was then asked to start, staff, be the Deputy Minister of the first Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And this, too, he made work. Now, in previous Tansley lectures, we've heard much about various aspects of public sector management and public policy. Tonight, the focus is on the relationship between government and the private sector. Now, there's one dimension of that equation that we've heard much about recently. It's known as public-private partnerships. It's called by a variety of other names in other countries. It's been the subject of much polarizing debate, a debate that has inevitably generated much more heat than light. Tonight, Mr. Manley is going to step back in order to take a more fundamental look at the relationship between government and the private sector. I think that you will agree with me that there are few individuals with Mr. Manley's depth of knowledge and experience on both sides of the public-private divide. Born in Ottawa, John Manley received his BA from Carleton University and his law degree from the University of Ottawa. He then clerked after completing his law degree under Chief Justice Borlaska. And then after entering the Ontario Bar in 1978, he became a tax lawyer. 1 decade later, he was elected to Parliament. I'm not quite sure how a tax lawyer gets elected to Parliament. But in addition to serving as Deputy Prime Minister, he served as Minister of Industry, Foreign Affairs, and Finance from 1993 to 2003. As Industry Minister, he was a staunch supporter of a Canadian-based research and development approach that included an information and communications a telecommunications infrastructure that would support the wired classroom and numerous other initiatives. His goal at all times was to improve education and skills at home and make Canada a magnet for the best from elsewhere. Following the attack on the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001, Mr. Manley became Deputy Prime Minister and Chair of the Cabinet Committee on Public Security and Anti-terrorism. He served as the Canadian counterpart to Tom Ridge, the first U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, in those most difficult years. He also had an excellent working relationship with Colin Powell. For all of this, he was named Time Canada's Newsmaker of the Year. In 2004, 1 year after making his own bid for leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada, Mr. Manley left politics and returned to the private sector. He joined the law firm of McCarthy Tetro and joined the board of directors of Nortel Networks and the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. He also became chair of the Independent Task Force on North America, a project sponsored by the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. In 2007, Prime Minister Stephen Harper appointed Mr. Manley to head an independent panel reviewing Canada's mission and future role in Afghanistan. And in 2009, he took up his current position as CEO, President of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. Please join me in warmly welcoming the Honourable John Manley for this year's Tansley Lecture.
Well, Greg, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, Mr. Minister, Mayor, other distinguished guests, Mr. McKay, who warned me that he was going to leave early too. Now, he worked for me in an important role in the Department of Finance. He used to leave early then too. I don't know, left before the job was done. You know, Mayor, it's always great to be in Saskatchewan, and Regina in particular. I just want to warn you, however, that in 2014, Ottawa will once again have an entry in the Canadian Football League. Now, they're not called the Rough Riders, and that's unfortunate because a lot of us grew up with the Rough Riders. They're the Red Blacks. That's what I said, too. Now, I asked a governor of the Canadian Football League, don't you have any kind of quality assurance on the naming of your teams? Like, why would we all grew up with the Rough Riders. He said, oh no, you can't have that. Saskatchewan will not allow it. So you better watch out, because there's a grievance to be settled. We sent you Ron Lancaster, and now you won't let us have the name? Really? Anyway, I'm really happy to be with you, to talk with you about some really important issues in public policy. And to the students, I want to say, you know, how do you go from practicing law, and especially doing business and income tax law, into Parliament? I'll tell you what happens. You actually really, really love public policy. And for me, it was actually the most direct route to being engaged in public policy. I went and got elected. Now I do public policy from outside, and I don't have to be elected. That's a lot better way to do it, I can assure you. But I had a wonderful experience. You've heard a bit about Donald Tansley already from Greg, and he made very important contributions, certainly in Ottawa, and I'm very proud to be associated through this lecture with such an important public servant. I never met him, but I have learned a few things about him because I've read a bit about him. Public service is a vocation, it's a calling. It's one best pursued by those who want to make a positive contribution to their country and to the world. This is something that is often forgotten today, and it's easily forgotten because we live in an age that tends to be marked by scandal and by cynicism. But if we're ever going to overcome the challenges that the world keeps throwing at us, it's essential that we continue to attract the smartest, most qualified, and most motivated people possible into the world of public affairs and public policy. And I suspect that some of those people are in this room tonight. Speaking of service to one's country, many of you will know that as a young man, Don Tansley, who was not yet 20 years old, saw action overseas in the Second World War with the Regina Rifle Regiment. Near the end of his life, he chronicled his wartime memories in a book that he entitled Growing Up and Going to War. He described his time in uniform as the most defining, the most unforgettable, and perhaps the most satisfying experience of my life. It's a short book, but it's deeply moving in its depiction of the horrors, the drudgeries, the fears, and the occasional moments of exhilaration experienced by young Canadian soldiers in that conflict. I recommend it to you if you want to know a little bit more about Don Tansley. The issues that confront us today are obviously of a different order than the hardships endured by that generation, which some call the best generation. The Canadians who came of age in the Great Depression and the Second World War. That is, in many ways, a testament to the country that they helped to build, a country that is among the most prosperous, tolerant, and best governed in the world. Our job, very simply put, is to try to keep it that way. Tonight I want to talk about some of the most important challenges facing Canada in the early 21st century. Challenges that I believe can only be overcome through close collaboration between government and the business community. Let me begin by sharing some of my own perspectives as someone who's worked on both sides of this public and private divide. When I first sought public office in 1988, I did so with the conviction that good government can be a positive force and a constructive tool for Canadians, and that our country could provide a unique example to the world. I did not, and to this day I do not subscribe to Ronald Reagan's belief that government is the problem rather than the solution. Government is not always all-wise, and all-knowing. But if you don't like government, just try anarchy for a while. And to this day, there are many parts of the world in which public order, safety, and respect for the rule of law are aspirations rather than the reality. I was far from alone in that view. Of course, my generation gained its political awareness in the 1960s, an era in which government had great ambitions. It was the time of John F. Kennedy's New Frontier, of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and of Pierre Trudeau's Just Society. The 1960s were a decade of idealism and great accomplishments in Canada. They were the formative years of the welfare state, including universal health care, which, as you all know, had its birth in this province, and the Canada Pension Plan. It was when we adopted our wonderful and distinctive flag. It was the time of a world exposition, Expo 67, and the birth of the Montreal Expos. Even the Leafs could win the Stanley Cup in the 1960s. In fact, they won it 4 times in the 1960s, and between the Canadians and the Leafs, they won the Cup 9 times out of 10 in the 1960s. Trivia question, who won the other one? Chicago Blackhawks, 1962. But anyway, you never know when somebody's going to ask you that. Canadians were, I think, generally deferential to authority, comfortable with activist, robust government. We truly believe that government could define the great objectives of the nation and then move forward with vigorous determination to achieve them. I still believe that, in fact. But if 16 years in the House of Commons teaches you anything, it's that the process of developing and implementing public policy is often painfully slow and tedious. And there's a reason for that. Some would say, if you like laws or sausages, never watch either of them being made. But public servants and elected officials face the challenges of society as a whole. They deal on a daily basis with complex stakeholder issues, conflicting objectives and time horizons, different ideas of what constitutes success, and rely on power that rests on the public's perception of their legitimacy. The emphasis is on consultation and consensus building, to the point where outsiders sometimes mistakenly assume that nothing is actually getting done. Many people in the private sector have only a vague idea of how government functions and how decisions are made in the public context. CEOs, especially those who are engineers or whose thinking has been shaped by technical backgrounds and formal business education, tend to adopt what I call a linear approach to problem solving. Power flows from the top down and performance is measured objectively on the basis of metrics, total shareholder value, profitability of your enterprise compared to others in the same sector. My role now is interpreter. I interpret the public sector to the private and vice versa. And I always tell them, in the private sector, rule 1, government is non-linear. Rule 2, by the way, is elections are disruptive events. If you want to call Pauline Marois, she might explain how that's true. George Shultz, a great government and business career. He served as both U.S. Secretary of State and U.S. Secretary of Treasury. He once said, as well as CEO of a large corporation and in the academic sector, he said that I learned in business that you had to be very careful when you told somebody that's working for you to go and do something, because the chances were very high that he'd do it. In government, you don't have to worry about that. Politics, as I was saying, is in contrast inherently nonlinear. There's rarely any easily understood bottom line, and things don't often unfold in predictable ways. Public opinion can shift unexpectedly, driven by unforeseen events, close to home or perhaps half a world away. In the political world, you can be evaluated and your career destroyed on the basis of one errant remark or one ill-considered expense account claim, despite years of sound performance. The perspectives of those in the public sector and the private sector are therefore fundamentally different. In government, the best elected representatives and public servants see themselves as trustees of the public interest. When I was a minister in Ottawa, I took for granted, in contrast, that when a business person came to see me, it was out of self-interest. In fact, I'd say I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of business leaders who came to Ottawa to talk about the national interest, or who would contemplate for even a second putting the interests of Canada as a whole ahead of their company's interests. Now, I was speaking with some of the faculty earlier today, and it brought to mind the fact that one of those people was the great Alan Taylor, who was CEO of the Royal Bank, who came to see me when I was industry minister to try to persuade us at a time when we were cutting every element of our budgets that building a synchrotron facility at the University of Saskatchewan was a good idea. It had nothing to do with the Royal Bank. It had nothing to do with Alan Taylor personally. And he just thought this was big science and Canada should do it. And we did. Usually, though, they came to talk about something that was pretty granular, very specific to their own firm, or at best their own industry. Not that they didn't often pitch their wishes in terms of the national interest. Of course, the distinctions between private and public interest can sometimes get a little bit blurry. In 1953, Charles Wilson, who was then the CEO of General Motors, told a Senate committee in Washington that, quote, "For years I thought that what was good for our country was good for GM and vice versa." His comment, which is frequently misquoted as, "What's good for GM is good for America," has been really derided ever since as a sign of the arrogance of big business. But the notion that a nation's economic success is linked to the success of its business community is not, in fact, exactly far-fetched. Economies are complex ecosystems. The presence of good public policy and sound governance creates an environment that attracts private investment and enables enterprises to grow and to create jobs. In the absence of these, or in the face of corruption, the entire ecosystem withers up. The recent Economist cover story on Argentina documents what happens when a country rich in natural and human resources endures generations of bad public policy and poor public governance. Canada's experience has been much more positive. It's an interesting analysis to line Canada and Argentina up at the starting line in 1900 and see how they compare. And place your bet, not knowing the outcome, on who will win the race for the next century. Argentina had more GDP, a better educated population, every asset you could imagine going for it, including more arable land. And 100 years later, Canada is a G7 country and Argentina is a basket case. What's the difference? The difference is sound public policy and good governance over all those years. So Canada's experience has been relatively positive, but most of the business leaders that I know would still prefer to avoid dealing with the public sector if they can. They tend to view government, and politicians in particular, as fickle and unreliable. Don't know where they get that idea. Business people will talk about the major projects they wish that government would approve and the economic activity those decisions would generate. But they know that if for some reason the political winds blow in a different direction, years of planning and millions or billions of dollars of investment can just go down the chute. It'll come as no surprise to you that a lot of business leaders view the public sector as inefficient, remote, overly hierarchical, slow to respond to changing circumstances, and hidebound by outdated practices. Competition in the marketplace forces companies to serve the needs of their customers. If they don't, the customers will take their money elsewhere. Citizens, in contrast, can't easily switch governments. It's much more than a touch ironic that governments in Canada are constantly telling the private sector that it needs to be more innovative. In business, innovation isn't an abstract concept or an excuse for yet another task force or study or two-day conference. It's how you generate sales. It's how you beat back competitors. It's how you survive to fight another day. These inherent differences between government and business are a constant source of frustration to people on both sides. And they help to explain why public-private collaboration is rarely that simple or that straightforward. Government and business have different objectives, and they operate by very different rules. But in an era of fiscal constraint and increasingly complex, multidimensional problems, I'd argue that we really do not have a choice. Indeed, the need for closer collaboration is growing. In my current role as head of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, I spent a lot of time talking to senior business leaders in Canada and elsewhere. I invariably ask them about the big issues that are preoccupying them, what it is in the environment in which they're operating their business. What are the forces that are likely to shape that environment? What I find interesting is that increasingly, the things that they worry about, the challenges and risks that keep them awake at night, are some of the same issues that loom large on the public agenda. These, I believe, are the issues where the need for cooperation and collaboration is most acute, where we need to arrive at a common outlook on both the right public policy responses and the right private sector response. Now, there's a long list of these challenges. But what I really want to do is give you something to chew on figuratively as well as literally this evening. So I'm going to just talk about three of the issues in particular, which I think will have profound implications for both the public and private sectors in Canada. These three issues are the massive shift of global economic power toward Asia, demographic forces and the impact of an aging population, and the growing and potentially devastating threat of cyber warfare. So I'll touch on each of those. First, the global gravity shift. Dominic Barton, who's the Canadian-born global managing director of McKinsey, has described the economic shift toward emerging markets as the defining megatrend of our age. The scale and speed of this shift are breathtaking. Over the next 15 years, the number of middle-class consumers around the world is forecast to double, with virtually all of this growth concentrated in Asia. Currently, only about a quarter of the world's largest companies, firms with revenues of $1 billion or more, are headquartered in developing countries. By 2025, that number will jump to almost half. So from 25% to 50%. Across Asia, more than 250,000 men, women, and children migrate from rural areas to cities every week. 250,000. 6 of the world's 10 largest cities are in Asia, and within 20 years, so will be 3 of the 4 largest economies. Needless to say, our nomenclature of developing and emerging economies is rapidly becoming inappropriate. For Canada, Asia's rise represents huge opportunities, but creates an equally significant set of challenges. Most of us here were privileged to grow up in an era in which Canada was one of a small handful of industrialized countries with well-educated populations and high standards of living. That's why we're part of what is now, once again, the G7. No one has called us on the fact that our economy is no longer among the world's 7 largest. Currently, we rank 11th, according to the IMF and the World Bank. Like the NHL's original 6, that world is now just a memory. The league of countries in which we compete continues to expand. The pressures from newly industrialized economies grow ever more intense. If we thought Canada was a relatively small player in the global economy before, then we better brace ourselves for the future. As recently as 1980, Canada accounted for 2.5% of global GDP. Today, we are below 1.8% and falling. And our relative economic footprint is going to get much smaller in the years to come. Now, in itself, that's not a problem. There's no law that says small countries and modestly sized firms cannot compete successfully in global markets. But when scale is not on your side, you have to make sure that you're doing everything else right, because your ability to influence the rules of the game is going to be minimal at best. Trade strategy is critical. So, Canada needs to negotiate improved access to the markets where economic growth is forecast to be strongest. And companies need to work harder to build relationships where currently their presence is weak. We need to build stronger state-to-state relationships. We need to get over our fears about rising levels of Asian foreign direct investment. And finally, we need to recognize that over the next 2 decades, Asian producers will move into more direct competition with us as they develop their capabilities. To stay ahead, it's essential that Canada address its lagging productivity and become more actively engaged in value-added manufacturing and service global supply chains. In other words, every business requires an Asia strategy. If it is not directed towards supplying Asian markets, at least it needs to deal with anticipated Asian competition. For government, facing up to this new era means paying closer attention to Asia in general and to China in particular. It means more official and unofficial visits. Our government leaders need to get to know their government leaders. Every time, I experienced this as foreign minister, every time that there's a new president in the Oval Office, Canadian journalists go into a swoon over which international head of government is going to have the first meeting with the new president. And if it's not the Canadian Prime Minister, then heaven help us. We're already falling behind. But it's now been more than a year since Xi Jinping was elected president of the world's 2nd largest economy. Has anyone mentioned that Prime Minister Harper has still not visited him in China? Have we noticed that Chancellor Merkel of Germany has visited China 6 times since becoming Chancellor in late 2005? Prime Minister Harper in office almost as long has gone only twice. By the same token, business cannot simply rely on government to open new markets for Canadian trade and investment. Unfortunately, if understandably, Canadian companies tend to keep their gaze firmly fixed on our southern border. When the United States is enjoying strong growth and when Canadian exports are welcomed, everybody is happy. But when the U.S. economy turns sour, when protectionism is on the rise and Buy America is the mantra, or when Washington won't approve our pipeline while greenlighting dozens of their own, we suddenly remember why trade diversification actually matters. To succeed in many of these newer and emerging markets, a partnership with one's home government is crucial for business. Good government-to-government relations are equally essential if we hope to advance Canada's national interests. It's in this context that the recently concluded trade and investment agreement with Korea is important. It represents Canada's first trade agreement in the Asia-Pacific region. Negotiations have been going on with Singapore since 2002. They've been on hold since 2009. If the Korea deal is followed by a robust economic partnership agreement with Japan, an ambitious Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the trade architecture will be in place for Canada to make some significant headway in those markets. But success will only come if Canadian businesses make use of these new trade bridges, and if Canada makes the necessary investments in trade facilitation, and if we ensure that our partners live up to the commitments that they've made. Of course, Asia's growing importance extends beyond the economic sphere. The strategic relevance and geopolitical importance of China, Japan, and the rising nations of Southeast Asia cannot be overlooked in a hyper-connected world. Just as our businesses need a strategy to address the opportunities and challenges of this new age, our diplomats and our political leaders must invest time and effort in building relationships, in understanding the minds and motivations of those in power. Canada does not need to be a missionary state to maintain our support for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. But whether we like it or not, we will be living in a world in which authoritarian capitalism produces more GDP than does democratic capitalism. Now I'm going to switch ground totally and talk about what I'm calling the demographic time bomb. And here we're thinking about the post-war baby boom generation, which I was talking about gaining their political awareness in the 60s. It's been the demographic engine driving social change now for close to 60 years. And it's now approaching the retirement stage of life. Today there are 21 seniors. This is really important for the students, because guess what? This is going to cost you. 21 seniors today for 100 Canadians of normal working age. So 100 to 21. That figure will rise to 50 by 2056, a shift that is going to have profound impact on almost every aspect of public and private life, from government revenues to patterns of personal consumption. As the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Stephen Pawles, said recently, the long-term trend of an aging population has important implications for our economy. People who are approaching retirement tend to save more and spend less. That, of course, is understandable. It may even be commendable. But every dollar funneled into savings is a dollar that does not get spent on consumption, at least not now, which translates into weaker consumer demand and lower revenues for governments through consumption taxes. At the same time, the departure of the boomer generation from the workforce will exacerbate the emerging problem of labor shortages. Now, we can already see this starting to happen. In 2011, the growth rate of the population of working-age Canadians fell below that of the overall population for the first time in half a century. The Bank of Canada expects that next year, labor's contribution to potential GDP growth will be half what it was in 2007. When business cannot find enough workers, they will tend to invest less or look for ways to shift activities to jurisdictions where labor is more plentiful, not to mention cheaper. The inevitable result for Canada is an economy that expands at a rate slower than historic norms. Another inevitable result is that government revenues are going to be squeezed at exactly the same time. The demand for public services is going to rise. Proportionally fewer citizens will be working, paying tax, making pension contributions, while a larger share will be collecting pension benefits and receiving social assistance and making demands on our public health care system. Canada's retirement income system will be seriously tested, as will our publicly funded health care system, because older patients require more frequent and costly care. And politicians who ignore these pressures will be taking a big risk, because seniors tend to follow politics more closely and are significantly more likely to vote than younger citizens. These are complex challenges for government as well as for business. Many of them require public policy responses, including decisions around mandatory retirement ages, flexibility in pension funding requirements, and the rules that determine when you can begin to collect pension benefits. Employers are increasingly worried about the availability of skilled workers and about how to encourage greater participation in the labor market from underrepresented groups. Concerns about Canada's labor needs are to an increasing extent shaping discussion about immigration policy and leading some to call for dramatic and sustained increases in immigration levels. In all of those areas, there's an obvious and growing need for close engagement between the public and private sectors in defining our country's needs and building consensus around possible solutions. Equally, we need to bear in mind the international context. Population aging is not a uniquely Canadian problem, and the hyper-connectedness of our world means that the global talent hunt is sure to become more competitive. This is an issue that Canadian educators are clearly understanding. Our universities have done pretty well, I think, in attracting foreign students, and by the way, their fees. And the federal government has wisely made it easier for foreign students to remain in Canada after they graduate, rather than sending them home and forcing them to wait years before they can return. But we need to do a lot more to attract the world's smartest and most skilled people to our shores. It's difficult to contest the assertion that the Australians, among others, are eating our lunch when it comes to recruiting students abroad. The federal government's recently announced Global Markets Action Plan rightly identified this as a priority area, but the amount of money allocated to improve our performance, $5 million a year, to promote Canada as a world-class education destination, is hopelessly inadequate. Within the business world, the focus on attracting and retaining talent has never been stronger. Many of the CEOs that I represent point to this as being their chief preoccupation, their biggest risk factor, talent. For that reason, we've recently launched a multi-year initiative called Taking Action for Canada, Jobs and Skills for the 21st Century. Now, just think for a moment about the number of high-demand jobs that barely existed 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, from mobile app developer to digital marketing strategist, Zumba instructor, sustainability expert. In Canada, we have traditionally relied on government to educate and train each new generation, and for the most part, our public education system has performed very well by international standards. But the job market and the nature of work itself are changing rapidly. This underscores the need for close collaboration between educators and employers. Whether we're talking about co-op programs, internships, apprenticeships, or continuing education in the workplace, we need to recognize the role of employers in ensuring that our labor force has the knowledge and skills required to sustain Canada's high quality of life. A few words about cyber threats. Now, threats and opportunities are two sides of many coins. In our hyper-connected world, opportunities abound, but are offset by extremely serious threats. Now, I wrote this before we had any clue that the Canada Revenue Agency would have to shut down for several days because of a bug that was discovered in their networks. But close collaboration between government and the private sector becomes crucial to boost our defenses against cyber attacks. And the urgency of this undertaking, I simply don't think it can be overstated. This was once almost fictional. In fact, not that long ago it was thought of as fictional. The term cyberspace was actually coined by a Canadian, a Vancouver-based science fiction writer named William Gibson. Cyber warfare, though, is now a real and present danger to IT networks. IT-dependent systems, and critical infrastructure, all in sectors like transportation, communication, finance, and utilities. Earlier this week, I distributed among my CEO members a paper which we entitled What Every CEO Needs to Know About Cybersecurity. In it, we point out the following, that it was a mere 20 years ago that the internet went mainstream. In the early days, cybersecurity was about locking up laptops at night with sensitive data on them. Today, everything is networked. We efficiently sell to customers across the globe. We precision manufacture our products with electronically controlled machinery. We provide services and customer support online. Twitter is our news feed. Our cars, homes, and electrical grid are increasingly smart. Information technology is at the center of our lives, and data is the foundation of the modern economy. Everything that is networked, however, is hackable. A vast array of criminals, foreign governments, and activists are seeking to compromise company networks and steal their most valuable data. Like the web itself, these threats are global. When the bad actors succeed, they can compromise the very achievement of core business priorities. This is increasingly so as we multiply the connectedness through the use of sensors in a wide variety of places. These attacks threaten states as much as they do individual companies and organizations. Some appear to originate with foreign military and intelligence services. Others are the work of criminal syndicates, terrorists, or even lone individuals. Eugene Kuparski, a Russian-born information security expert, says his firm now analyzes an average of 200,000 samples of malicious program per day. That was 25 a day in 1994, 700 in 2006, and 7,000 in 2011. So from 7,000 to 200,000 a day in 3 years. Some of these cyber weapons have the power to disable companies, cripple governments, and in Kuparski's words, bring whole nations to their knees. President Obama has described cyber terrorism as one of the most serious economic and national security challenges facing the United States and other Western nations. To put it mildly, this is a complex challenge. Any effort to strengthen our society's digital defenses must balance national security interests, privacy concerns, intellectual property rights, and individual freedom of expression. Some of the initiatives launched to date have been criticized as overly intrusive, and there have been too many instances in both the public and private sectors in which sensitive information has been handled carelessly and with inadequate concern for the privacy rights of citizens. But for the sake of our national and economic security, we need to work together more closely to boost the resilience of our digital networks and critical infrastructure. Neither government nor the business community can do this alone, a fact that both sides, I think, have begun to recognize. To its credit, the federal government in Canada has taken a number of steps over the past year to improve information sharing and collaboration in this area, one of which was to ask for my help in creating a CEO advisory panel for cybersecurity. So, as I wrap up, the list of challenges for which there is urgent need for closer private-public collaboration and cooperation is a long one. I've picked 3. They might not even be the most important ones. I didn't talk about climate change or environmental protection. I didn't talk about water scarcity or food safety or the threat of global pandemics. I didn't talk about social inequality or the risk of another financial crisis or the political paralysis that is holding up important new investments in energy infrastructure in this country and others. All of these problems are complex, multifaceted, and they involve a wide range of stakeholders and conflicting objectives. That's what you're studying, how to solve those types of problems. They're interconnected. They cannot be addressed in isolation. Each one poses a risk to society as a whole, and to the business community, and to specific firms and sectors. The scale and cross-cutting nature of these challenges demands that government and business work as partners in developing potential solutions. For business, this means recognizing the vital role of the public sector, moving away from the top-down linear decision-making and learning the value of the multi-stakeholder approach. For government, it means embracing the need for innovation and experimentation in the development and delivery of services, leveraging the capacity of the private sector where it makes sense to do so, and having the courage to take the long view on the big issues that will shape our future. Each side must learn from the other. The scope and complexity of the problems we face leaves us with no other option. I am so happy that we have built in Canada a network of first-rate schools of public policy, and some of our best students and smartest individuals want to pursue those courses of study. Because if this is the starting line, and we're here, Argentina might be behind us now, but let's recognize that we're in a world in which we are in a race. And as Ian Bremmer has said, it's every nation for itself. So we need to collaborate among ourselves to find the answers to some of these complex, difficult solutions if we're going to continue to build on the base of prosperity and success, peace and good government that has made Canada the great country that it is. Thank you very much for your attention.